Devastating new details about Mark Knopfler have left Dire Straits fans shocked and heartbroken. Once the driving force behind one of rock's most legendary bands, Knopfler now reveals devastating new details about Dire Straits, the reason they'll never unite. Behind the fame, there's a deeper story, a tale of success, struggle, and personal decisions that shattered the dreams of millions. Stay tuned as we explore the reasons behind Knopfler's decision and uncover the truth behind Dire Straits' untouchable legacy. Mark Knopfler's rise to legendary status in the music world did not start with arenas and awards, but in a humble flat in Glasgow, Scotland. He was born on August 12, 1949, to an English mother, Louisa Mary, who was a schoolteacher, and an architect father, Erwin Knopfler, who immigrated from Hungary into England in 1939 to escape persecution by the Nazis. At an early age, Mark became captivated by his uncle's harmonica and boogie-woogie piano. These instruments told stories, and the impact of that kind of storytelling in music would someday find its way into Mark's songwriting. He encouraged himself and whined to his parents for a guitar in hopes of strumming like his hero, Hank Marvin of the Shadows, whose red Fender Stratocaster had become iconic. Finally given a Hofner super-solid guitar, less opulent than a Stratocaster, it still ignited his passion for playing. Mark soon proved to be driven by his mastery of the instrument. Though music was a deep love, it was not his only pursuit. In his early teens, Mark became a voracious reader and started working Saturdays at the Newcastle Evening Chronicle by the time he turned 13. It was then that he became great friends with poet Basil Bunting, whose literary presence would stay with him for many years to come. Yet music always had a gravitational effect. Mark soon began to experiment with various musical genres and styles, highly influenced by rock and roll, blues, and folk. He would sit for hours and listen to great storytellers like Elvis Presley, Chet Atkins, and B.B. King. The guitar would become his main vehicle of expression, and his finger-picking technique, which would later define his signature sound, began to take shape during these formative years. But what was it that drove Mark to push through adversity and stick with music? Could it have been fate or something deeper that pulled him toward his true calling? Despite his growing interest in music, Mark decided he would undertake a formal education. He attended Harlow College and graduated in 1968. Following his passion for writing, he took up journalism for a year, working as a junior reporter for the Yorkshire Evening Post. But even though Mark admired journalism as a craft, the need to create music would not leave him. Even while interviewing others, he knew his true voice was the guitar, not the typewriter. It was in Leeds that he met Steve Phillips, a fellow blues enthusiast, and together they formed a duo called the Duolian String Pickers. Following another stint in school at the University of Leeds in 1973, Mark began teaching at Loughton College, where he lectured for 3 years. Still, in spite of the academic surroundings, the fire of music inside didn't cease but flared even stronger than ever. It was at this time that he recorded the first of several demos, including one named Summer's Coming My Way. The first recordings didn't get much recognition from the wide masses. However, they laid the foundation for what was to come. Music still wasn't paying the bills, so Mark juggled his teaching with gigs in local bands such as the Cafe Racers, playing pubs and clubs around England. It was at one of these serendipitous gigs that Mark found this old warped acoustic guitar. The guitar was almost unplayable, but to avoid breaking it, he developed a delicate finger-picking style. Little did he know that this technique would become the signature sound that separated him from other guitarists in the industry. He often looked back and said that it was this moment in forced adaptation that helped him find his voice on the guitar. During this period, Mark's younger brother David, who also had musical ambitions, moved to London, and the two brothers shared a flat with John Ilsley, a talented bassist. Their flat was a creative hub filled with music and ideas, and these three talented men often played together informally. There was instant connection on both musical and personal levels. They realized they had something special. In 1977, with John on bass, Mark on lead vocals and guitar, and David on rhythm guitar, they formed what would become one of the most iconic rock bands in history, Dire Straits. They completed the group with drummer Pick Withers, another great musician who equally shared their vision for refined music. Their early sessions in London's pubs may not have filled the venues, but they honed their craft, blending bluesy rhythms with thoughtful melodic arrangements. By the late 70s, London's musical scene was already buzzing with the raw energy of punk rock. Bands like The Clash and Sex Pistols had risen against that status quo, flooding the air with fast-paced, aggressive music. Yet, amidst this noise, Dire Straits came out with a sound refreshingly different, understated, melodic, and deeply rooted in storytelling. Set against a backdrop of excess and rebellion, Dire Straits brought in something different, and Mark Knopfler's quiet, finger-picked guitar style quickly made waves. Their formation was swift, but the chemistry between the band members was undeniable. With Mark on lead vocals and guitar, his brother David on rhythm guitar, John Illsley on bass, and Pick Withers on drums, this quartet shared a vision to make music that was somewhat different from the trends. In a small basement in Deptford, London, they started to rehearse, and magic happened. The sound was tight yet relaxed, with rock, blues, and folk mushed together in a special brew of music. It wasn't long before they'd recorded a demo tape, which featured 5 songs, including what would be their breakout hit, Sultans of Swing. The song told the story of a jazz band playing in a nearly empty pub, a tribute to the purity of playing music out of love for it rather than fame or money. Ironically, this song about obscurity and modesty would make them stars. The demo made its way to BBC Radio London DJ Charlie Gillette, who played Sultans of Swing on his show. The song went down great with listeners, and the record labels soon started knocking at their door. The band signed with Phonogram Records, after which they entered the studio to record their debut album, Dire Straits. It was a slow burner when it was released in 1978, but once Sultans of Swing started to gain traction internationally, the album exploded onto the charts. Sultans of Swing was a perfect showcase of Mark Knopfler's understated guitar brilliance. His intricate fingerpicking, clear melodies, and conversational singing style invited comparisons to another hard-nosed storyteller, Bob Dylan. Critics and listeners hailed Mark's playing, noting his ability to make the guitar talk without the need for aggressive distortion or flashy solos. He developed a voice on the guitar, a sound that was so distinctive you could recognize him as the guitarist after just a few notes. On the heels of this surprising success for their first album, Dire Straits were suddenly in high demand. The band undertook relentless touring throughout Europe and the United States. The more successful Dire Straits became, the greater the pressure. The music industry is so unforgiving, and Dire Straits was thrown into the maelstrom of constant recording, interviews, and touring, and yet they were true to themselves. Mark, as the principal songwriter, resisted the temptation to chase fleeting trends. Instead, he dug in deeper and wrote songs that told stories, whether about love, loss, or those small moments in life that often go unnoticed. Their second album, Communique, which was released in 1979, followed the success of their debut. Whereas it didn't quite reach the commercial success that Dire Straits did, it more importantly nailed the band's place in the rock pantheon. With songs such as Lady Writer and Once Upon a Time in the West, Mark was able to show that he had matured as a songwriter, with lyrics that painted clear pictures of characters and scenes. The album's sound was definitely more polished, yet still retaining that minimalist, bluesy feel that had made their debut so unique. The band's growing success didn't just come from their records. Their live performances were just as popular. The audiences loved the dynamic among them on the stage. There was something organic about their performances, a feeling that every night was unique. Yet Mark was as unpretentious and grounded as ever, even though the band was beginning to get very famous. He had little use for the rocker's life that came along with success. He spoke humbly and introspectively during interviews and always seemed to be more focused on his music than the trappings of celebrity. The sincerity only made him and the band even more likable to their fans. By the time the 1980s came around, Dire Straits was on the cusp of something bigger. Their third album, Making Movies, released in 1980, was the turning point. Produced by Jimmy Iovine, who had worked with Bruce Springsteen and Tom Petty, the album featured a more expansive sound. Songs like Romeo and Juliet and Tunnel of Love became instant classics. Romeo and Juliet, in particular, became one of the band's signature songs, its poignant lyrics capturing the bittersweet nature of love and loss. By the mid-'80s, Dire Straits had attained a level of worldwide stardom that very few bands ever experienced. Their music had captured the hearts of fans across the world, but it was the release of their fifth studio album, Brothers in Arms, in 1985 that propelled them right into the stratosphere of rock stardom. Brothers in Arms was a phenomenon. From the opening notes of So Far Away through the epic melancholy title track, the album was a true showcase of Mark's evolution as a songwriter and musician. But it was the track, Money for Nothing, that became the breakout hit, thanks in part to its groundbreaking music video. The song was both a commercial success and a cultural commentary. It gained popularity over the world, sitting atop charts both in the US and the UK and winning Dire Straits their first Grammy Award. Money for Nothing was also helped by MTV, which was at its peak during the 1980s. The song's animated music video, featuring blocky, computer-generated imagery, was very revolutionary at the time and became one of the most played items on the channel. The line, "I want my MTV," sung by Sting in the opening, became a catchphrase, further securing Dire Straits' place in pop culture. But Brothers in Arms wasn't just about one song. The album was a cohesive body of work that explored themes of love, war, and the human condition. The catchy pop tune Walk of Life, with its energetic, pulsating keyboard riff, was also another chart topper, in contrast to darker, more somber tones found in songs like Ride Across the River and Brothers in Arms. The latter song talked about the senseless carnage of war, and this struck a chord with listeners, especially as the Cold War was looming at the time. The success of Brothers in Arms was staggering. It went on to become one of the best-selling albums of all time, with sales of over 30 million copies worldwide. It was the first album to sell 1 million copies in the CD format, still quite new at the time, and played a significant role in popularizing the medium. Dire Straits' world tour in support of Brothers in Arms was equally monumental. The band played to sold-out stadiums and arenas across the globe, including a legendary performance at Live Aid in 1985. Their set, which included Money for Nothing and Sultans of Swing, was one of the highlights of the historic event. The tour itself lasted over a year, with the band performing in front of millions of fans across 5 continents. Brothers in Arms won numerous awards, including 2 Grammys and several Brit Awards, and the album's influence was felt far beyond the music industry. At the end of the 80s, Dire Straits was at the peak of their success. All the fame, constant touring, and being the face of one of the world's biggest bands didn't come without its toll. He'd always been more comfortable in the shadows, crafting songs and perfecting his guitar technique than in the spotlight of global superstardom. As the 80s drew to a close, Dire Straits was at the peak of their success. They had achieved a level of fame that few bands ever reach, and their music was making waves in the world. In many ways, Brothers in Arms represented both the pinnacle of Dire Straits' success and the beginning of the end. The album had catapulted them to the top of the music world, but it had also exposed the cracks within the band and the personal toll that fame was taking on its leader. For Mark, the question wasn't just how to sustain this level of success, it was whether he even wanted to. The dizzying heights of fame that Dire Straits reached did not altogether eliminate the pressures that came with success from straining the band. By the end of the Brothers in Arms world tour, cracks were already showing. both within the group and in Mark Knopfler's relationship with the life of a rock star. Long before the seeds of discontent had been sown, and now they were starting to take root. The first serious sign of trouble came with the departure of Mark's brother, David Knopfler, in 1980 during the recording of their third album, Making Movies. David's exit had dealt a blow to the band's dynamic, and though he had never been as central to the group's creative direction as Mark, his departure left a hole. The brothers had always had a somewhat strained relationship, in which David often felt overshadowed by Mark's talent and leadership. The tensions between them had grown during the recording sessions to such a degree that David simply walked away from the band altogether. When asked if his brother knew he was going to leave the band, David responded, "Yes and no, not really. We were all burnt out, too many gigs, too much work, too much stress, not enough downtime. And things were just going from bad to worse, and I decided I had enough. I booked a flight, packed, and came back to England, and I didn't regret it for a second and haven't since." As the 80s wore on, Mark chafed under the demands of fame. The massive success of Brothers in Arms had turned Dire Straits into a global brand, and with that came the relentless pressure to maintain that level of success. But for Mark, the joy of making music was beginning to be overshadowed by the obligations of stardom. All the touring, media appearances, and demands put on him by both his fans and the music industry were starting to wear him down. For Mark, music had always been a personal and creative pursuit. He had never chased fame for the sake of it, and all that came with fame was really nothing he cared about. At heart, he was a storyteller, a musician who wanted to get better and better at what he did, rather than basking in the adoration of millions. But as the frontman and principal songwriter of one of the world's biggest bands, the spotlight was unavoidable. The longer he spent in it, the more uncomfortable he became. And this was compounded by the grueling schedule of the Brothers in Arms World Tour. The tour, which spanned over a year and took the band to every corner of the globe, was physically and emotionally exhausting. While the shows themselves were a complete success, playing to sold-out stadiums and arenas night after night, the relentless travel and lack of personal time took their toll. Mark, always having been more of an introvert, found the demands of being continually on increasingly difficult to manage. In an interview with the Irish Times, Mark shares that the gigs get to a point where they become too frequent and so large that the energy changes, and not in ways he was comfortable with. It suits some people. You can get used to the scale of it. I don't know if I ever really did. What happens there is that the gig becomes an event. There's a different energy. He added, "If you're playing events all the time, some great blown-up festival, some great inflated thing, then you are losing something as well. That's how it seemed to me. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I should have kept playing, let it get as big as Brazil." Tensions within the band also began to rise. While Dire Straits had always been Mark's band as far as creative decisions went, the other members, especially John Illsley and Pick Withers, had always contributed greatly to the formation of their sound. Yet, the more famous the band became, the wider the gap grew between Mark and the rest of the band, especially Pick Withers. Just 2 years after David Knopfler left the group, Pick also left in 1982. When asked in a 2021 interview why he left the group, he explained that several reasons caused him to leave Dire Straits. "We started to play very loudly. I was beginning to have trouble with my ears, although I didn't realize what that was at the time. I just remember coming off stage and having trouble with my balance, readjusting after being on stage, so that was that element." He went on to say that the music was going away from stuff where I felt that the drums could make a significant contribution or certainly be part of the conversation. It was getting much more kind of, this song is black, this song is blue, and starting to do rock stadium kind of stuff where it just doesn't translate to the way I wanted to play, you know. Then there are a whole raft of personal aspects, the dynamics between main individuals, which I don't want to discuss in this kind of interview. It just sounds like sour grapes or whatever it is, you know, which I thought, yeah, I think it's time to do something else now. After David and Pick left the band, only Mark and John remained. Whenever they had to perform, They hired extra hands to fill in the spots left open. By the time the band finished their world tour in 1986, Mark was burnt out. Combined with the stress of maintaining their success, plus the personal toll of being in the public eye constantly, he wondered if he wanted to continue with Dire Straits at all. He took a step back from the band, focusing on other projects such as producing albums for other artists and working on film scores. Such projects gave him the opportunity to pursue avenues in music different from those he had with Dire Straits, without feeling the pressure of being the face of a global phenomenon. But even as Mark distanced himself from the band, demand for Dire Straits' music remained strong. The record company and the fans were clamoring for more, and the success of Brothers in Arms had raised expectations higher than ever. The band's hiatus was short-lived, and in 1991 the band returned with its sixth studio album titled On Every Street. While commercially successful, the album failed to quite reach the same level as that of Brothers in Arms, and it seemed rather obvious that the band's time at the top was slowly drawing to a close. By the beginning of the 90s, Dire Straits was a band in name only. Following the release of On Every Street in 1991, it was clear that the spark that once ignited their music was fading. The album was commercially successful, but it lacked the urgency and innovation that had been instrumental in much of their earlier work. Opinions were divided. Many critics and even fans felt that Mark Knopfler's heart was no longer fully invested in the band. The long hiatus that followed Brothers in Arms had sapped a great deal of creative momentum, and while On Every Street had its moments, it lacked the artistic highs compared to their previous albums. The subsequent tour, which spanned nearly 2 years, was ambitious in scope, but it further siphoned the energy out of the band. Playing night after night in huge arenas and stadiums had gotten repetitive, and the thrill that came with live performances had given way to a sense of obligation. The grueling nature of it all began to take its toll on Mark and the band members, emotionally and physically. By the time the On Every Street tour was winding down, it was quite clear to everyone concerned that Dire Straits was running on fumes. The exhaustion was too much, and Mark had no desire to continue under the same circumstances. He saw the writing on the wall and made the difficult decision to quietly disband the group. There was no formal announcement, no farewell tour, just a quiet dissolution of one of the most successful rock bands of all time. For Mark, it was a necessary end. He wanted to return to the simplicity and joy of making music without the weight of the Dire Straits name hanging over him. The great success of the band had come with many personal and creative costs. He was tired of the machine Dire Straits had become, and he longed for his musician-songwriter grassroots without the huge expectations that came with the band's global success. But could there be any hope of a Dire Straits reunion? With so many legendary bands reuniting over the years, fans have clung to that dream. Yet the reasons behind the band's quiet dissolution reveal something deeper. Could this really be the final word on Dire Straits? Over the years, fans have clamored for a Dire Straits reunion, hoping that Mark Knopfler might bring the band back together for one more tour or album. However, it has become abundantly clear that such a reunion is highly unlikely, if not impossible. Mark's feelings on the matter have been consistent. He has no interest in revisiting the past, and the idea of reforming Dire Straits doesn't appeal to him in the slightest. One of the primary reasons for this is that Mark views Dire Straits as a closed chapter in his life. The band had its moment, and it was a moment of great success and creativity, but Mark has always been more interested in looking forward than backward. For him, music is about growth and evolution, and he sees little value in trying to recapture the magic of the past. He's said in interviews that he's moved on, and that the joy of music comes from exploring new ideas, not rehashing old ones. There's also the issue of the toll that the fame and pressure of being in Dire Straits took on Mark. The demands of constant touring and the expectations of fans, the media, and the industry wore him down. While he still loves making music, he's made it clear that he doesn't miss the grueling schedule and the public scrutiny that came with being the frontman of one of the world's biggest bands. Reuniting Dire Straits would likely mean returning to that lifestyle, something Mark has no desire to do. Furthermore, the relationships within the band, while not antagonistic, have shifted over time. The departure of key members, including David Knopfler, created rifts that were never fully healed. While Mark has maintained friendships with some of his former bandmates, the dynamics that once held the group together have changed, and it would be difficult to recreate the chemistry that defined their early years. Since the dissolution of Dire Straits in the early 90s, the band's former members have each pursued their own paths, finding success in various endeavors. Mark Knopfler has enjoyed a highly successful solo career, releasing numerous albums that have garnered critical acclaim. His solo work showcases a more introspective folk and blues-influenced sound, and he has continued to tour regularly, albeit on a smaller scale than the massive Dire Straits tours of the past. In addition to his solo albums, Mark has also composed several film scores, including the acclaimed soundtrack for Local Hero. John Illsley, Dire Straits' bassist and one of Mark's closest collaborators, has also pursued a solo career, releasing several albums that blend rock and folk influences. He has remained active in the music scene and occasionally performs Dire Straits songs during his live shows. John has also taken on other projects, including painting and writing, showing that his creative spirit extends beyond music. Guy Fletcher, who joined Dire Straits as a keyboardist in the mid-'80s, has continued to work with Mark on his solo projects and has become an important member of Mark's touring band. In addition to his work with Mark, Guy has been involved in various other musical projects, both as a performer and a producer. David Knopfler, Mark's younger brother, has also carved out a solo career, albeit on a smaller scale. His music tends to be more introspective and acoustic-driven, reflecting his own personal style. Although the brothers have not worked together since David's departure from Dire Straits in 1980, David has continued to build a loyal following of his own. As for other former members of Dire Straits, many have remained active in the music industry, either as session musicians or pursuing their own creative projects. While none have achieved the same level of fame as they did with Dire Straits, they've continued to contribute to the world of music in meaningful ways. Dire Straits' legacy is undeniable. They are remembered as one of the most influential rock bands of the late 20th century, known for their unique blend of rock, blues, and jazz, and for Mark Knopfler's distinctive guitar work. Their albums, particularly Brothers in Arms and Making Movies, continue to be regarded as classics, and songs like Sultans of Swing, Romeo and Juliet, and Money for Nothing remain iconic. In 2018, Dire Straits was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The induction was a long time coming and recognized the band's enduring impact on music and popular culture. However, the event was somewhat subdued as Mark Knopfler chose not to attend the ceremony. His absence showed his decision to distance himself from the legacy of Dire Straits, preferring to focus on his solo work and personal life rather than celebrate past achievements. Nevertheless, the induction was a fitting tribute to a band that had achieved so much. Dire Straits' music has stood the test of time, influencing generations of musicians and continuing to captivate fans around the world. Their legacy as one of rock's greatest bands is secure, even if the possibility of a reunion remains forever out of reach. Could Mark Knopfler ever reconsider his stance and surprise fans with a reunion? Or has Dire Straits truly closed the book on one of rock's most iconic legacies forever? Let us know in the comment section. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.